From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. We hope that you and your family are sheltering in place in a comfortable environment, and we look forward to welcoming you back in the grill room just as soon as conditions permit. Many of us native San Franciscans remember a time when anchovy and smelt were abundant in San Francisco Bay. My dad used to fish for them all the time, and he used them as bait to catch bigger fish, striped bass and salmon. And there were even tales of anchovy raining out of the sky. Were these tales true? To investigate such claims, we found a genuine expert in this subject. Jim Ervin is a volunteer researcher at UC Davis, Otolith Geochemistry and Fish Ecology Lab. Jim, welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. It's great to be here, and I really am happy and excited to give you a talk about that.
Yes, our viewers have heard about fish literally raining out of the sky, but it seemed like a fantasy. And you researched these fish, which are prey for bigger fish, and have looked at their cycles for decades. We want to listen to your story. Help explain this to us.
Well, I've been studying anchovies specifically in the lower South San Francisco Bay, so that is my particular area of expertise. They're bay anchovies. They're part of a bigger population of anchovies that live in what we call the California current, as I'll explain, up and down the coast of California, from Oregon or Washington State down to Baja, California. And anchovies live around the world, but our particular anchovy, the northern anchovy, some people call it the California anchovy, lives off the coast of California. And yes, you are correct. Anchovy rain is not just a fishtail. It doesn't happen all the time, but when anchovies are abundant, fish feast, or I should say birds feast on the anchovies, and sometimes get so stuffed that they drop the anchovies and it falls as a rain. My particular aspect of this story and how I came into it is I've been working with the UC Davis researchers for several years. We perform monthly trawls of lower South San Francisco Bay to monitor the fish and bugs. I call them bugs, the small critters that live in that corner of the bay. The UC Davis folks have been doing that monitoring since 2010. I joined them around 2014, I would say. This year, we saw a huge increase in anchovy catches since January. And then in June 2022, the numbers went over the top with over 2,600 spawning anchovies when we usually catch less than a quarter of that number. So we knew something strange had happened, and I submitted a monthly blog report to the UC Davis website in mid-June 2022. So within a week after filing that report, we realized that this was much bigger than just lower South San Francisco Bay. On June 24th, a Facebook friend named Jay Davis from San Francisco Estuary Institute posted this photo down in the lower left-hand corner. Those are 100,000 seabirds called sooty shearwaters that were mobbing the ocean just off Half Moon Bay. This was one of many reports of people enjoying the beach and the coastline, noticing a huge increase of offshore seabird, pelican, and marine mammal activity that was all targeting massive schools of anchovies. And then the same day, June 24th, 2022, Bill Keener from the Golden Gate Cetacean Research Group emailed some of us to confirm that marine mammals and seabirds had been active for over a week at that point. And Bill photographed both humpback whales and gray whales feeding off of anchovies just off of Pacifica Pier. And he sent this photo on the upper left of a gray whale performing what he calls the sharking maneuver. And that's where the whale rolls over on its side and puts one pectoral fin and a fluke tip up above the water. It looks like a pair of sharks are swimming along. Whale opens its mouth and engulfs, whole schools of anchovies. And this was right next to the pier, literally within a stone's throw of the beach itself. And then just a few days later, a marine mammal researcher up in Marin County named Sarah Allen, she emailed this photo over on the right-hand side of a massive die-off of anchovies in Bolinas Lagoon. For some reason, the anchovies by the millions crowded into that lagoon over the weekend of the 25th and 26th of June 2022 and suffocated and died. Clearly, we were experiencing some kind of an anchovy event. It was not the first time that any of these things had happened, but it was the first time in a long time and the first time that many of us had ever seen it. And then a few days later, I was finally able to get up to Pacifica Pier, and unfortunately I missed the big event, but I was able to get a close look at some of the anchovies. There were many anglers on the pier and they were pulling up anchovies by the dozens. And I did kind of an inspection of some of those just to see what I could see. And I could also see a whale spouting off far in the distance, but that was the best I could get, closest I could get to the big event on the coast. But within a few days, the local media broadcast a slew of reports about Anchovy Rain across San Francisco, in addition to all those other events. And apparently seabirds flying over the city had become so stuffed that they were randomly dropping anchovies on streets and sidewalks.
How many inches is that? I can't tell.
It's 10 inches total. And what I'm showing here are the two major species. I'm going to diverge a little bit and talk about both sardines and anchovies, because the two species go together like peanut butter and chocolate, I suppose. They both are coastal fish that live very close to the shore. The sardines range a little bit further offshore. The sardine is the bigger of the two fish, and I'm showing a little stick that's showing about 10 inches. Sardine ranges from 10 to 12 inches for a big full-sized adult, whereas an anchovy, I think of them as a half-size sardine. They grow up to 6.5 inches, but no bigger than that. And most anchovies are a little bit smaller, around 4 to 5, 6 inches for a full-grown adult. Both of these fishes are filter feeders, which they have a filter within their gill apparatus. And they eat the same kind of food, near microscopic planktonic animals of different types, with the preferred food being different species of tiny crustaceans called copepods, which I'm showing some examples over on the left-hand side of the screen. Ironically, the sardine is the bigger of the two fishes, but it eats the tinier copepods that are usually less than about 1 millimeter long. So, I mean, these are literally bugs that many of them, you can't even see them with your naked eye. They're that small. The smaller anchovy eats slightly larger copepods, the tiny crustaceans that and other tiny crustaceans that may range up to a few millimeters or even a bit larger. And that difference in food is what kind of segregates these two populations. The sardine tends to range a little bit further off the coast, eating smaller, more oceanic type of copepods, whereas the anchovy usually hugs pretty close, doesn't really range that far out in the ocean, and it likes to eat the bigger bugs.
How far is pretty close?
Yeah, so I'd say the sardine will range quite a bit further, maybe out to 100 miles offshore, and the anchovy range probably no more than 30 miles offshore. Both fish will come very close into the shore for feeding, because that's usually where the more productive water is. With the anchovy actually penetrates very, very frequently into bays and estuaries and such, including Lower South Bay, where I'm working with these researchers. And this is showing, I wanted to do a comparison between the theoretical drawing, and these are the real fish. This is a sardine that we caught in Lower South Bay. We catch those very, very rarely. We've only caught 3 in several years of trawling, whereas with the anchovies, we catch thousands every summer. The anchovies just love coming into the bay. And I'll point out that as you well know, some of our most popular game fish, like the striped bass, like the salmon, like the whales and the seals, they all eat anchovies and sardines. Without the anchovies, without forage fishes are the small, shiny fishes, pelagic fishes that everything else eats. It cycles that carbon up through the ecosystem, and the things that we enjoy, like the game fishes, they become the index of the success or failure of our ecosystem.
I caught this one right outside the Golden Gate, 40 feet down in 80 feet of water in about October 2021. There seemed to be a run. There was a run of salmon around then. Help us understand the relationship between these sardines and anchovy population booms and busts and runs of like this one that I caught. Yeah,
there's no question that big salmon was eating anchovies in 2021. We had 2 La Nina years. We're in the second of 2 La Nina years, and we think we might be entering into a third La Nina, which is a little bit more unusual. But yeah, that La Nina cycling, as I'll explain, it increases ocean upwelling, it increases food production just right along the coast. And anchovies absolutely thrive on that. Those are those tiny bugs I was talking about. You get your The ocean upwelling brings nutrient that creates a bloom of phytoplankton, small, tiny, single cellular plants all across the ocean. And then the small bugs, these little copepods, feast off of that, and the anchovies just swarm. And then, the sardines, the seabirds, the seals, the whales, they all feed off of that. Well, as we'll get into, that's like the basis of the whole ecosystem. And speaking of that, and the salmon do eat small sardines as well. And most of these bigger critters in the ocean, they'll feed off of either anchovies or sardine, depending on what's available. And the anchovy sardine story really starts early in the century, and it's a very California story about the sardine fishery that started in the 1910s and 20s. Sardines at that point, California sardines supported the biggest fishing industry in the Western Hemisphere. It was starting about the time of the First World War. It was a major and growing industry in Los Angeles, San Luis Obispo, and Monterey through the 1920s and 30s. And as we all know, John Steinbeck wrote the stories about Cannery Row and Monterey. But by the late 1930s, at least a few fish researchers began warning that the sardine fishery was in danger of being depleted. The industry had just gotten too big, so it seemed. And unfortunately, by that time, the nation was at war, World War II, and sardines were critically needed as food for troops and food at home. And so the fishing continued at a high pace, and the warnings were ignored. And then shortly after the end of the war, the fishing industry collapsed absolutely. The sardines, virtually were just wiped out. And so a lot of people were really concerned and alarmed about what had happened and how it had happened. And so at the prompting of the fishing industry and with its financial support, the California State Legislature in 1949 established a program to study one fish, the sardine, and figure out why it collapsed. And their first report of its investigations was released in 1950, and showing the cover there. And although there was still much uncertainty at that point, it was clear that it wasn't just overfishing that killed the sardine fishery. It was a combination of heavy fishing pressure and ecological factors that led to the collapse. And the same ecological factors could well apply to any other marine fishery off of California, and more research was needed. And so thus was born an institution called CalCOFFI, the California Cooperative Fisheries Investigations, or CalCOFFI for short. It is a partnership between NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service, CDF, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And the initial goals of CalCOFFI quickly expanded from just sardines to include all the complexities of sea life in the ocean off of California. And they say, according to CalCOFFI, and I'm kind of reading their brochure, that CalCOFFI is the oldest integrated ocean observing program in the world. And they made many interesting discoveries as I'll go through. CalCOFFI pioneered the study of marine populations in relation to their ocean environment, and really much of what we know about the ocean oscillations and such. At the very least, they began that study. Anyway, in relation to the world, what they found was that the California current is part of a great clockwise circulation of the North Pacific Ocean. It's what we call an eastern boundary current, one of several currents on the eastern boundary of continents. I'm listing 4 of them here: the California current, the Peru current. There's a Canary current off of Europe and Africa, and the Benguela current off of the southern portion of Africa, and there's a couple others in the Indian Ocean. The only unique thing, or the interesting thing about an eastern boundary current like the California current, is that those tend to flow from the poles south, tends to be cold water washing against the continent. And so you get this greater amount of upwelling, as I'll explain.
Created by the equatorial current, which is created by the Earth rotating toward the west as it rotates on its axis. Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, much of the basics of that much was known, but where CalCOFFI really advanced the science was, we've known for, I think, a century or two that there's a thing called El Nino, because this is what Peruvian fishermen, would talk about, that there were just some years where the sea surface temperature got a little warm around Peru and Ecuador, and the fishing just went bad. And it wasn't clear. It was clear that it was a pattern every 4 to 7 years, an El Nino. And they called it the El Nino because it usually coincided around Christmas time. And so this was the arrival of the baby boy, El Nino. Bad fishing would be bad for a year or two until it improved. Where CalCOFFI an interesting thing happened. There was a strong El Nino in 1957, 58. It was a researcher named John Isaacs at Cal Coffee first realized that they were seeing tropical conditions that changed way across the ocean and the small atoll islands at the same time that the warm sea surface temperature was happening in Peru, and they realized this is a Pacific-wide event, the biggest ocean in the world, and Pacific-wide. This El Nino was bigger than just the coast of Peru and Ecuador, and it was just more about simple poor fishing along that coastal area. And it took a few more years to realize that there was a bigger thing happening, and they now call it the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO for short. And it's an alternation between El Nino and what was later called La Nina, the opposite of El Nino is the baby girl. And that's where the opposite condition happens. It usually alternates between El Nino, La Nina in a few to several years. La Nina is cool surface temperature near the equator, far off in the ocean from Peru and Ecuador. El Nino, the warm water. The La Nina condition creates very good cool surface water and very good fishing off of California, the boundary currents, California current and the Peru or Humboldt current down in the south. And these are positive and negative portions of that La Nina ENSO cycle. And then just in the last really 20 years ago, they and this is more researchers than just Cal Coffee, but this became part of the anchovy sardine story. They found that there's a bigger decadal oscillation, and they really, part of the evidence for this was these changes in anchovy and sardine populations that they seem to correspond, and other fishes as well, but they seem to correspond to a bigger cycle in the ocean that runs about 30 years per half cycle and 60 years for the whole cycle. And they call it the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And again, it's a warming of the ocean off of North America, a little bit south near the equator, but off of the Americas. A warming of the ocean is the positive phase of the decadal oscillation. And then when the system flips and the entire ocean gets cooler near the equator and off the Americas, and it gets warmer up in Northeast Asia. Anyway, they saw a strong correlation between these populations. So this is taken from a paper, Chavez et al. 2003. And they found a very strong correlation where during the Eastern Pacific cool phase of the PDO, you get a lot of anchovies. We're currently in a cool phase, and that's part of the reason we're seeing so many anchovies. Back in the 20s through the 1940s, we were in a warm phase. We had a lot of sardines, and then the sardines crashed. We had anchovies, and then around 1980 through 2000, sardines came back, and then they crashed. And now we're again in this anchovy phase. And all the sardine and anchovy populations around the world follow a pattern like this, although being in different ocean basins, they don't necessarily coincide with the same timing. Yeah, long story short, we're seeing a lot of anchovies this year, and it was raining anchovies in San Francisco, partly because we're in a double La Nina, not just a single La Nina, but we're in the second year of a La Nina regime with lots of cool ocean upwelling. And we've been in a cool phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation since 2000. And so the Cal Coffee researchers have been tracking anchovy populations and sardine populations. Of course, that's their main job. And they've been seeing this steady increase in anchovy populations since 2015, rising to, the highest level so far measured at this point. One of the interesting things about it was that we had a very strong, I'm sorry, my slide, I say La Nina. We had a strong El Nino and a marine heat wave, which they called the blob back in 2013 through the El Nino actually started 2014, 2015. And these warm sea surface conditions, everybody at Cal Coffee predicted that the current anchovy boom was gonna absolutely crash, and it didn't. It continued on. And in Cal Coffee papers, I read through some of their literature from their December conference, December 2021. They call it a legitimate scientific surprise, to quote from them, that nobody saw that coming. And it's so interesting that after all these years of studying, they are still discovering new things about anchovies and sardines. The sardines are going through a pretty severe crash right now. When we have a warm sea surface temperature, you would think sardines should be coming back. And in contrast, it's more than just sea surface temperature is the conclusion. It's that upwelling off the coast is just absolutely foundational. And anchovies are perfectly able to just hug the coast a little closer and stay in that food production zone. This also partially explains why we've been hearing so much about whale entanglements in recent years, and probably, no doubt, absolutely no doubt, why you caught that big salmon off the coast is because the anchovies are just doing very well. And I like to say it's all about the food. It's all about food production right along the coast. So I was going to switch gears a little bit and just say, I work with the Otolith Geochemistry and Fish Ecology Lab of UC Davis under Dr. Levi Lewis, who is the director of the lab. And we like to think of our program as a micro mini version of Cal Coffee, whereas Cal Coffee has giant ships and they perform surveys way out in the ocean, hundreds of miles out into the ocean from Southern California up to San Francisco. We have small boats. That's our flagship right there in the photo. We monitor just within lower South San Francisco Bay, south of the Dumbarton Bridge, going into the sloughs and marshes and evaluating all the different kinds of critters. Go out monthly, perform surveys, and the design of the monitoring that we perform was created by Dr. Jim Hobbs, I'm showing there. He is the former director of the lab. He currently works at California Department of Fish and Wildlife and frequently checks up on the progress of our work as well. This is showing circling the area down in lower South Bay, south of the Dumbarton Bridge, where we trawl. The primary focus and funding for what we do is on long fin smelt, which is the threatened fish, the threatened pelagic fish, not unlike the sardine and the anchovy, but it's a fish that lives primarily in the San Francisco Bay, going up into the Delta and just off the coast. It tends to stay maybe this side of the Farallon Islands for us, although the longfin smelt does range all the way up to Washington State, but usually in bays and estuaries, not quite as far out in the ocean as anchovies and sardines. And it is another forage fish that all the bigger critters like to eat. And then we also, in the summertime, we do collect a lot of northern anchovies. We're not really funded for performing any kind of research on anchovies, but we do track them. We're actually working on developing some more research into their behavior. So this is showing a map of the area that we trawl from the lower South Bay, the deep stations in the main body of lower South Bay, going up Coyote Creek and pretty far up into the different stretches of Coyote Creek and Artesian Slough, and then the Guadalupe River, which is also known as Alviso Slough. These are the Alv stations, and Guadalupe Slough going down towards Sunnyvale. It is a very highly urbanized, small little corner of the bay. There's about 2 million people that live around this portion of San Francisco Bay. It was heavily, heavily impacted by development in the past. All of these greenish areas that look like marshes at this point were converted to salt ponds back in the late 1800s through the 1930s. When I started working at the city of San Jose in 1990, there was practically no marsh out here. There was a small amount of restoration that had happened in the small corners up in this area. Since 2004, there is a project, a very big project called the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. And so far they have breached ponds here. These are ponds A21, A19, A20, and also pond A6. And also this complex, we call it the A8 complex, is now open and circulating with bay water. The restorations in the A21, A19 now provide additional marshes, we're probably talking about 3,000 to 5,000 acres of marsh that has been developed just since 2004. Greatly helps the local environment down here. As we go through the different types of things that we fish for, it kind of amazes me that anything survived back in the bad years. Sometimes I get dismayed that, even 3,000 to 5,000 acres down here, which in comparison to what we had, it seems huge. But when I look at a space map like this, it's like, this is postage stamp stuff. It's like we're supporting an ecosystem with very little. This used to all be natural marsh. It's it was gone, and now we've got a tiny little postage stamp marsh areas that support the things that we're seeing that all show as we go on.
So what you're saying is that it's being restored, and that's why we're seeing more little fish, because there's more spawning grounds?
I think so. I believe so. We're definitely seeing more, and we're now in the 2006, so 16 years And yeah, that's about right. We're seeing more. We see more marsh plants, and so it's looking like a healthy marsh. And we're seeing more spawning fish. So things seem to be lining up. But I do have to caution that I think everything's kind of balanced on a knife edge. All it takes is one really bad rain year or one really bad drought year. I'm always cautious that the whole thing could collapse. But so far, so good. It's looking good.
Now, weren't there 10 stations? What's the station consist of? Is that a buoy or what is the station?
No, not at all. Not at all. It's just a GPS point on the map, and it's a location where we basically set up the boat, and then we trawl with a net, put out an otter trawl net is what we call it, and tow it for 10 minutes at that station. And that's what a station is, just a location.
I get it. So that's, and you go back and test periodically on a schedule so that you can measure the change in plankton or other sea critters that are thriving there.
Yep. So I call them fish and bugs. We trawl for fish and bugs. And yeah.
How big are the nets?
The net is about 14 feet wide and about 4 feet tall, I guess, when it's fully opened, and it drags along the bottom. And these sloughs are very shallow, so even a 4 foot tall net almost covers the entire water column in most cases when we're at lower tides. And the length of it, I don't know, about 10 or 15 feet long, I think, and basically trawl at a very low speed and try to catch as many tiny creatures as you can.
What speed?
About 2 knots. Essentially, you want to sweep the same volume of water each time for consistent results. And we also have a little meter out there that tells us, how many, what the exact distance was that we traveled as a check on that. Not just the time, but also we get volume of water that goes through the net. And this is kind of a backstep parenthetically, but way back in 2015, when just as I was first started working with these guys, we were catching this fish that normally never swims further north than Point Conception near Santa Barbara. It's called the Stripe Mullet. And this had to do with those warm sea surface temperatures from a strong El Nino in 2014, 2015. And it wasn't just at our location down in Lower South Bay, but also around the Bay and Delta, people were catching Stripe Mullet. And I just found it so fascinating that from my perspective, this was literally just footsteps from my office in San Jose. And we were catching this, call it the El Nino fish. And I realized, wow, these ocean cycles are actually felt here. It's like the butterfly flitting its wings in the Amazon. And here's this fish that I'd never seen before. I was absolutely hooked. I was like, wow, I want to do more of this. So anyway, this is showing some of the process. So we tow the net through the water. This would be, I believe this is Olive 3 because it's got the PG&E tower in the background. And we bring the net in, dump the contents into a tub, have a little bit of oxygenation to keep our fish healthy. And it's basically like almost like tending your own aquarium. You get to pull all these critters, everything that was in the bottom of the ocean, or in the bay in this case, and you pull out and sort the different fish and bugs, count them quickly. We generally release every fish and bug that we catch. The one exception is the long fin smelt in the winter, because those are brought back. Many of those are brought back to the lab for further analysis, because that is a threatened fish. What we do catch, in addition to small fish and bugs, we catch some larger things as well. Like very often catch leopard sharks. I think we had 6 leopard sharks last weekend. We had 2 months ago, we caught 50 baby leopard sharks, little guys about 6-8 inches long. Occasionally we catch the bigger adults. And once or twice a year, we catch a big sturgeon, as shown on the right side of the chart. Sturgeon usually, the big strong fish usually outrun our nets. So we don't usually catch the bigger ones, but once in a while they make a wrong turn and we pick them up. And, we measure them, count them, put them back in the water. It's not really, the purpose of our research is really the tiny fish and bugs at the bottom of the food chain. The bigger fish are just kind of incidental to the catch.
So we sailors are thinking about ebb and flood currents all the time, because they can provide an advantage in a slow moving sailboat race.
Yes.
What about the ebb and flood way down here by El Viso? How much do you see, and how does that affect, what kind of animals or what kind of fish are inside your nets.
Yeah, it does absolutely. We always tow against the prevailing current, but the prevailing current changes at least twice a day with the tide. There's a huge range of tide in Lower South Bay. Tides tend to amplify as you get into shallower and shallower water, and so the entire San Francisco Bay acts like almost like a funnel. And so the range of tide at the Golden Gate is roughly 2 feet. 2 feet. When you get to Lower South Bay, our range of tide is up to 8 feet. It's a big range of tide. And the fish, absolutely time, like the anchovies, for example, and any of these fish, as they migrate into the bay, they do what I call surfing the tide. So they'll swim in as the tide's coming in, and they'll sort of station themselves as the tide sweeps out, and then come in with the next tide. And when they migrate out, they do the same thing. It's kind of amazing how quickly they can move from one side of the bay to the other. And basically every winter, we have certain species that come into Lower South Bay to spawn. And then in the summer, it's alternate species. So in the winter, long fin smelt, also starry flounder, the big mama starry flounders, like the one shown there, they'll swim up all the way to the first riffles of creeks and rivers, deposit their eggs, and then go back out to sea. And then, a few months later, towards summertime, we start seeing lots of baby starry flounders. Same thing, halibut's a little bit different. The halibut actually spawn deeper in the bay and off the coast, but their fry come into the bay, come into the shallow parts of the bay near the rivers and creeks. And we usually catch smaller halibut, about a foot long or smaller, and they come in to recruit and feed off of all the bugs that also, spawn. Again, in Lower South Bay, what we have is almost like a microcosm of what I was describing on the coast. The cool ocean upwelling off the coast feeds all the anchovies and other fishes ultimately. In the South Bay, and in any kind of estuary, when you get closer to the creeks and rivers where the creek water is flowing out, it brings nutrients, which immediately feed phytoplankton, which then feed small bugs, and then you get all these fish that are just spawning. It's spawning heaven where we trawl here. This is showing the types of tiny fish and bugs. These are small shrimps down to a tiny little variety of shrimp we call mysids. They tend to bloom in the late winter and the spring when the rivers are flowing and all that nutrient is being churned up. And so you get the tiny shrimp, and then you get the bigger shrimp all the way up to, bigger bugs and such that bigger fish eat. And so I call it the fish buffet down there. And the bigger shrimp, these are the California native crangon. They call it Crangon franciscorum. So this is a San Francisco crangon. They come in every December. They don't actually spawn. They do what's called brooding. The females are already fertilized. And you'll see here in the photo, these white baskets of eggs that they're carrying in their rear legs. It's just quite a sight. We get buckets full of them in a good year. This La Nina year is not particularly good for crangon. And so we had a very small spawn. And also, really, it's more about the drought year. The crangon, they're a saltwater species. They don't tolerate fresh water, but they want to get as close to that freshwater mixing. And when they release those eggs, the tiny little fry, again, like the halibut, they swim upstream to get in that fresher water where they grow big. And then they'll gradually migrate back out to the deeper bay as they grow up. In fact, the crangon, I consider it a very important species in Lower South Bay. And unfortunately, we don't have as many. I'm certain it's not as many as there used to be in the distant past. So here I'm showing some of the non-native shrimps. Another ongoing problem, despite all of the successes, we have many non-native types of critters and fishes in Lower South Bay and in San Francisco Bay generally. In fact, the popular expression is that San Francisco Bay is the most highly invaded estuary in the world, or at least one of the most highly invaded. And most of these came in as ballast water invaders. In the ballast of ships, you get the tiny little organisms or the tiny little fry, I guess larval shrimp or larval crabs and clams, and they'll ride along on the ship. And then, in our major port in Oakland, they discharged the ballast water decades ago, and these types of shrimps and bugs would get released. In this case, I'm showing just two examples of many examples. The most creatures that we observe are the non-natives amongst the bottom dwelling type of critters. And in this case, it's an exopalamon shrimp and a paleomon shrimp. These two came from Asia, Northeast Asia. They call one the Oriental shrimp and the other one is the Asian prawn. And I can't remember which is which, but in any case, they're here now, and there's probably no way they'll ever be extirpated. They do compete with our native Crangon franciscorum. They don't wipe them out. They do exist side by side, but I have to assume that these take some resources from our native shrimp.
And when you say ballast water, just for our viewers, talk a little bit about the ballast water process. They're going, big ships go to Asia, come back. How does ballast water keep them more stable at sea and so on?
Ocean-going ships take on ballast water and discharge ballast water as they move from port to port. Say they're in a ship is in the port of Busan, Korea, or perhaps
Singapore.
Yeah, Singapore, yeah, and they take on some ballast water. And even if they do change ballast water a few times out in the ocean, there's still a chance, and actually over time, there's a certainty that they're going to be carrying with them certain small critters that might have come in from that other coastal port. And when they discharge in San Francisco Bay, the Water Board has had a program for at least a few decades where there's now protocols that ships have to discharge their ballast water when there's so many miles out to sea before they come into the port. And there are inspectors that check on that sort of thing. However, in many cases, the damage was done decades ago, and we now have non-native clams, non-native snails, non-native shrimps, and some other things that have gotten loose. And this is a problem all over the world, but San Francisco being a major port and a large estuary, it's a fairly big one that goes on even today. In addition to everything else we catch, as mentioned before, we catch lots of anchovies in summer through fall. This is showing an example from last January, a tray full of anchovies. And again, January was our record-breaking month in 10 years of trawling, and then June was our second biggest month, with the major difference being that now it's summertime and the anchovies are spawning. And then in wintertime, we get, our primary interest is the long fin smelt, and this is the threatened fish in California. Maybe later this year, they might even designate it as endangered. There's been discussion for about 10 years about whether the long fin smelt has declined in population to such an extent in the San Francisco Bay and Delta that it should be listed as endangered. In this case, I'm showing an example of spawning long fin smelt, and the males get very dark like that when they're in fresh water. Normally it's a silvery fish and another forage fish that everything eats. A little bit more detailed description of the anchovies and the long fin smelt. In this case, for the anchovies, we have a very interesting and unique situation where our bay anchovy is a little bit different than the ocean-going anchovy. And it was first described by a very famous ichthyologist named Carl Hubbs. He was a founding father of Scripps Institute and also Cal Coffee that I just described. One of his lifelong pursuits was studying the impact of climate on different species of fish, and the anchovy, and actually the sardine, the anchovy, and the herring were three focuses of his interest. Back in 1925, he performed a series of surveys up and down the California coast, and shown here on the slide, he called it the racial and seasonal variation of the Pacific herring, California sardine, and California anchovy. And in his day, he called these racial differences that basically he described a subspecies of anchovy, a shorter variety with a transparent back, dorsal side shown up here, and then a darker anchovy that came in from the ocean. At that time, he would see the division, and he said that the wise fishermen of that time near Sausalito were aware of these migrations of the ocean-going type of anchovy and the bay anchovy. And so it's become kind of a focus of what we look at in the summertime. As the anchovies come in and in the winter, we see these two different varieties, as Hubbs described way back when. There's what we call the brownbacks. These are shorter-bodied anchovy in the fresher water, and then this long-bodied seagoing variety. And in fact, what Hubbs described, and he actually dissected a number of these fish in 1925 and found that all three species, the herring, the anchovy, and the sardine, they grow shorter when they're in warmer water. They basically grow fast, but they reach their growth limit so fast that they don't develop about 1 to 2 extra vertebrae in their backbone. And so thus remain kind of like a little dwarf, stubby little fish if they're in bays and estuaries. And then farther out at sea in the cold Pacific water, they grow really long, and you got this long, skinny, dark-backed anchovy. Yeah, we've been really curious. Nobody's ever pursued this since 1925. What is the difference, and to what extent do these different types of anchovies mix and mingle? We know that they do. We know that we see seagoing anchovies coming in once in a while. We do seem to see both varieties in summertime. Very few of the big long ocean-going adults, but we presume that they're interbreeding with each other, and there is interchange between these populations. And so the big question is our bay population actually contributing to the population out to sea, or does the out to sea population just reseed our bay population and keep it going? This is showing an example of the beautiful anchovy colors. They range from blue to green and even to golden brown. This is showing the extreme varieties of the blueback anchovy and I call it the golden anchovy in the shallower water. And that's just interesting. But more recently, we've been solidly confirming that every summer these anchovies are coming into Lower South Bay to spawn. In a good summer month, I'd say that probably 80% of every anchovy we collect is a female with eggs, or either a female with eggs or a male with milt. They certainly are spawning basically at our upstream stations, which had not been known. It's been known for over a century that anchovies do spawn in San Francisco Bay generally, but the actual spawning grounds have never been identified to my knowledge. And certainly the spawning activity of anchovies has never been looked at so far upstream near the mouths of creeks. It's generally presumed anchovies spawn far out to sea. It just wasn't known by anybody that they really go up into near freshwater creeks at very low salinity, down around what we call 10 parts per thousand. And then this is showing more examples of spawning anchovies. We catch them so regularly in the summer that it's not a surprise anymore, but we do keep track of it.
Do they spawn at sea or?
Yeah, anchovies spawn both at sea up to 30 kilometers or 15 miles off the coast. In fact, it's presumed that the bulk of the anchovy spawning is the ocean-going variety, and they're out 10 or 15 miles out to sea. In fact, Cal Coffee, the primary point of their research is looking for larvae and eggs of sardines and anchovies off the coast. Cal Coffee doesn't look at in-bay or estuarine spawning anchovies at all, but we're finding that there's a lot of anchovy spawning going on in San Francisco Bay and especially far upstream in the estuaries. We presume from what we see that anchovies must be spawning far up in estuaries and rivers, up to the mouths of rivers, all up and down the California coast. But it seems to be an area that just kind of falls through the cracks. Nobody's really looked at it. We haven't been able to find evidence that anybody else has really been looking at it. And so anyway, we're considering doing some actual lab work on this sometime in the near future. At this point, it's all been by observation, just observation, checking out anchovies and seeing how they're spawning.
What's good about spawning in the creeks? What's good about spawning in the ocean? Why would they prefer one or the other, or do they?
Yeah, we don't know. Obviously, the anchovies we see prefer to spawn up as close to the creek mouths as they can get. We tend to find more anchovies with eggs way up in the fresher water, not purely fresh, but fresher water. And in very warm water. This is an ocean-going fish. Normally, an anchovy is an ocean-going fish that likes cold Pacific, not just cold Pacific water, but it likes colder Pacific water, the ocean upwelling water. And here they are swimming into very warm, shallow bays, very turbid water, completely different conditions than what the ocean-going anchovy would be expected to prefer.
Does that same anchovy that you catch in Alviso, does it go all the way up San Francisco South Bay, out the mouth of the gate, and go out into the ocean? What's the range of these fish?
This again, we don't know. We haven't done a workup. It would be, the first thing you'd want to check is genetics to see how closely or distantly related they are to the ocean-going variety. The other thing we could check is the otolith. This is the otolith Geochemistry Fish Ecology Lab. They study the otolith as an ear stone. Literally, otolith means ear stone. Each fish has two of them right behind their brain, behind their gill covers. And that ear stone can be read like tree rings. They can shave it down, file it down and put it in a microscope and see the tree rings, so to speak, and figure out how old the anchovy is. And they can also determine whether or not these anchovies are migrating out to the ocean. And you are correct. Some of these are young anchovies. I'm showing here two examples of anchovies with eggs coming out of their vent down below. they're not full size. These are down around maybe 2 to 3 inches. We find surprisingly small anchovies that are spawning ready. So they're less than a year old. They probably themselves hatched less than a year ago in San Francisco Bay. And whether or not they migrate out to the ocean is a question. I used to think so. I used to think that anchovies probably, the bay anchovies probably, maybe they develop for a year or two until they get strong enough and then they migrate out to the coast. I have changed my mind about that. As Hubbs described in 1925, the bay anchovies are basically permanently stunted. They just don't grow as long as their ocean-growing cousins because they grew up in warm water. And therefore, they're probably not terribly fit for ocean-going life. And therefore, we have sort of like a cul-de-sac population of anchovies that develops over time. I mean, clearly the ocean-going anchovies come in and they spawn at some point. Clearly, ocean-going anchovies have a preference at some point in their life cycle where they want to be near that fresh water. They want to be near that food, that abundant food source near the creek mouths. But then once they have progeny and those young grow up in that warmer and less salty water, they become a different fish, different variety of anchovies. Carl Hubbs, way back in 1925, said that this was a subspecies of anchovy. He wanted to name it as a completely different species.
What's the life cycle of an anchovy? How long do they live?
Anchovies live up to 7 years for a really old one. Very, very few get to that age because, again, everything wants to eat them. It's a very, very lucky anchovy that ever gets up to the full 7-year life cycle and up to full size. Most get picked off before they ever get that big. The other fish that spawns in exactly the same locations where we find spawning anchovies in the summer is the long fin smelt, which spawns at the same places in the wintertime. These are showing some samples of spawning longfins that we caught a year or two ago. And generally, the longfin is a little bit different. We do study their patterns and what makes them spawn here. Until 2017, it was unknown that longfins were actually spawning in Lower South Bay. And in fact, Dr. Jim Hobbs, who I mentioned earlier, had been looking for any evidence of spawning longfins in Lower South Bay at least 3 or 4 years and finding none. And then all of a sudden in 2017, everything flipped and we started seeing spawning longfins. And now we see them absolutely regularly since 2018, regularly and predictably at the upstream stations. And again, the same stations where the anchovies are spawning. We generally find the longfin, the way they spawn, the males usually swim upstream first around December. The switch in seasons with the colder water somehow triggers that tiny longfin brain to swim upstream, and the males will identify a suitable spawning spot, and they use their long anal fin to sweep dust and dirt away from a rock or gravel or a plant stem that they see, and whatever criteria they use to determine a good spawning place. And then they wait for the females to swim upstream and meet them, and then they'll do their spawning dance and lay these sticky adhesive eggs that then stick to that matrix and create the new generation. This is showing a couple of what we call ripe females. Each female will have at least several hundred up to several thousand eggs in her belly. And it's the way all fish spawn. They basically, at some point, something triggers the female to develop a lot of eggs. And she's basically bursting with eggs and has a great need to find a male, and always tries to find the best male, of course, the fittest male. And longfins, just like the anchovies and almost every pelagic fish you'll ever study, they tend to do their spawning dance at night, kind of like the grunion down around San Diego. With grunion, I think it's based on the phase of the moon. We don't know with longfin smelt or anchovies if that has any triggering to them. But anyway, when the time is right, they usually spawn at nighttime because a silvery fish trying to spawn in the day is going to get picked off by birds and such. And so they wait. Usually the hours are usually between 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. A couple hours around midnight is when they do their spawning dance.
Are there fewer predators where there's shallow water is?
I would say there's fewer seagoing predators, absolutely. Some of the spawn, not so much with the longfin smelt and the anchovy. Well, the anchovy, I think that is a key factor. The anchovies further out in the bay are subjected to a lot more bigger fishes and such. And we also see that with leopard sharks. Leopard sharks come into Lower South Bay as far as they can go, as far as their tolerance will allow, because there are no 7-gill sharks. There's no bigger sharks that will take out a leopard shark. The leopard shark mamas come and swim as far up into the lower South Bay and release 20 to 30 babies. We catch the baby leopard sharks all the time in lower South Bay. It's a safe zone for leopard sharks. It's a safe zone for baby bat rays. And as you go further up into the creeks and such, where the bat rays and the leopard sharks cannot go, that's where the long fin smelt and the anchovies spawn. So every fish is trying to get to that outer limit where it either can't, where there's a lot of food and it can't be eaten. And the season is right and the time is right. And you're right, the music is right, and they do their thing. Because we have identified this robust spawning zone of longfin smelt. It's one of the few, sometimes it's the only one left in the San Francisco Bay. There are some spawning longfin smelt up in San Pablo Bay and up in the north parts of the bay, but there's very few. And ours is the most regularly robust spawning zone. And therefore, we've started to support a new project, which is going to mirror a project that's gone on for several years now. It's with the UC Davis Fish Conservation and Culture Laboratory, or FCCL for short. The FCCL was established because the Delta smelt is virtually extinct now. The Delta smelt has been disappearing from the California Delta and Bay system for decades. The Delta smelt used to be the most numerous fish in the Delta and the fresher water parts of the Delta, in the same way that the longfin smelt used to be the most numerous fish in the bay itself. So as the Delta smelt was going extinct, UC Davis got tapped to start collecting live samples of Delta smelt and raising them in the laboratory to try to preserve them, because without that effort, without question, that the Delta smelt would be utterly extinct at this point. They set up basically a fish farm where they put the Delta smelt and have them spawn in these round circular tanks you see in the photo down below. And so in recent years, they've been realizing the longfin smelt is on the same downward trajectory, and we need to, as a safeguard, we need to start brooding these in tanks as well, just in case they disappear from San Francisco Bay. This image is showing the UC Davis Fish Conservation Culture Laboratory in Byron, California. It's located right at the Clifton Forebay, where the giant water pumps take up Delta water and send them down south to Los Angeles or into the aqueduct system. Also for the State Water Project, which feeds farms in the Central Valley.
What water is that? Is that San Joaquin River water, Sacramento River water?
It's part of the Delta system. I'd say it's probably a little more, it's more San Joaquin than Sacramento.
There's little smelt in those tanks? Yeah,
the smelts are raised in a laboratory environment, and they are, the adult smelt are kept in these round circular tanks. They bring them inside the laboratory when they're actually spawning them, and they raise the larvae in aquariums, basically, until they're big enough to kind of survive life in the tank. The FCCL has been raising Delta smelt for at least a decade now. The problem with this whole process is that it cannot go on forever. Once you start raising Delta smelt in these round circular tanks, after several generations, they are no longer naturally selected for the environment they used to grow up in. They're now laboratory fish that are specifically adapted to live in a circular tank. And so starting this year, the FCCL has begun taking some of their cultured fish and re-releasing them back to the Delta in the hopes that maybe conditions have improved, or at least we can understand how to improve them further so that this fish can once again live a natural life in the Delta. And they did have some success. They released them in December 2021, and they went back a few months later, and these Delta smelt, these lab-reared Delta smelt did survive, and they did manage to spawn at least once. And so they brought the progeny back to the lab to check genetics and see who's spawning with who. Yeah, the ultimate fate of this project, and they are at this point right now ramping up production of Delta smelt to start re-releasing larger populations back into the Delta. And again, all the conditions that killed off the Delta smelt the first time around are still there. You know, it's a last best hope, but it's the best you can do at this point. We're trying to work up to where we can do the same thing with longfin smelt in the near future. So anyway, this is showing, I use this comparison. When I visited the FCCL for the first time, at that point, they only had 3 round circular tanks. They've vastly expanded since then. And there were more Delta smelt in these round tanks than existed in nature anymore in the Delta. I mean, that's how far gone this fish is. And I likened it to the old 1972 movie, Silent Running, where Bruce Dern was out somewhere near the orbit of Saturn and was maintaining the last plant life on Earth. This is where we are with Delta smelt. I know it's a joke, but I find it so profoundly sad that and this is what we're trying to do for the long. I mean, we're just as a safeguard, we're trying to set up the same program for the longfin smelt. And my greatest hope is that our marshes in Lower South Bay will now sustain this population to where this won't even be necessary for the longfin smelt. That's the hope. And this is showing a typical weekend catch. This was back in 2018, but even now, numbers have gone up pretty substantially. But in December is when the longfins start migrating up into the creeks and rivers. And so this is showing you kind of the distribution. Those restored ponds, we're showing pond 20, A21, pond A19. I mean, they consistently support more of our spawning longfins and our spawning anchovies. I just find this so promising. It was just enough restoration, but in the nick of time, I think, before this species completely disappeared from the bay. I really hope that's what's happened here. And then we catch a lot of them. In fact, in more recent years, we catch more of them up in the upper sloughs and estuaries here. San Jose is due south down this way. In fact, Artesian Slough is where the San Jose Santa Clara Regional Wastewater Facility discharges treated wastewater, believe it or not. 800,000 people flushing their toilets, and businesses and such that discharge their wastewater goes to the San Jose plant, which is one of the most advanced treatment plants in North America. And they treat it, they call it tertiary treatment. And that treated wastewater flows out, and the threatened longfin smelt actually, and the anchovy literally spawn in Artesian Slough in addition to the rest of these areas. This was the other fascinating thing that pulled me into this research work. Was one of the most advanced and just a huge human population can discharge wastewater and still be so beneficial that it's supporting this spawning activity that we see out here. And my major point with this is where we also collect our what we call the brood stock that goes to the Fish Conservation Culture Laboratory. We do that on alternate weekends, not when we're actually doing surveys. And we collect the fish. We carefully put them in buckets with water quality that's maintained and with aeration. And we run them up to the FCCL with the least amount of time possible. It's a 50-mile trip to get them into the laboratory tanks so that they can hopefully survive best and then be bred in the laboratory. And the FCCL has been breeding longfins where they're not quite up to, it takes years to learn how to care for these fragile fish. With the Delta smelt, they've got the formula down, and their multiple generations have been bred. With the longfin, they've only been able to go 1 or 2 generations. They haven't been completely successful yet in sustaining this fish. And the urgency of doing this now is, we got to get past this learning curve, because a bad year could wipe out the few remaining longfins that are still around. It was really amazing that we found spawning longfins down in Lower South Bay. It's the last lifeline that we could possibly throw for this fish. The last encouraging thing was that 2022 was our record year for several species. We've been seeing general improvement. When I look at the data, and the data is always messy, there's a lot of variability, but our numbers are definitely increasing for longfin smelt and anchovies in Lower South Bay. That's what we call LSB. And up to this year to date is now our record year in 10 years for longfin smelt, anchovies, sharks, leopard sharks, bat rays, and gobies. The big question at this point is this a reflection of marsh restoration, or is it because we have this wonderfully productive La Nina year? The jury's still out on that part of the question, but I'm very optimistic that things are really improving out here.
So Jim, this is fascinating work. Holy moly. So from raining anchovies to the sort of volunteer science, which is basically helping to restore the wetlands in South Bay of San Francisco. It's very, very fascinating story. I'm so thankful that we have diligent volunteers such as yourself, basically toiling away in the weeds, as it were, helping San Francisco Bay be a healthier ecosystem. So thanks very much for being our guest on the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. And please continue your great work. It's God's work.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Ron. I really enjoyed doing this.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.